Our education work at the Gates Foundation within the US spans early learning, K through 12, and post-secondary education spaces. Our K-12 strategy focuses on supporting educators and district leaders in K-12 public schools in their work to improve math student outcomes for Black, Latino, and students from low-income backgrounds. Our pathway strategy is focused on supporting students in navigating key transition points to ensure success in school and into their career, with a focus on Black, Latino, and low-income students. And our post-secondary strategy is focused on supporting colleges and universities to increase student success and make sure that race, ethnicity, and income are not predictors of post-secondary success. Based on these larger meta goals, you can see why the Gates Foundation is a proud supporter of the Campaign for College Opportunity and its efforts to make post-secondary education accessible and attainable for California's diverse student population. And they have done that, and they continue to do that. On a personal note, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation as someone who was a student activist down the 10 and 405 freeways at UCLA during the 1990s, while the state, oh, I'm getting chills, I don't know why, but I'm getting memories here. During the 1990s, while the state battled for who belonged in California and who should be deserving to access and attend our public post-secondary education systems. These fights around immigration and educational opportunity dramatically changed the state of California. In the short term, the elimination of affirmative action in California led to the precipitous drop in admission of Black and Latino students at the University of California, particularly the most competitive campuses, including my alma mater, UCLA, and further segregated an already segregated state college and university system across the state. On the other hand, these realities also set in motion many efforts, movements, and initiatives, most notable efforts to figure out more creative ways on how the state could continue to provide opportunity to its diverse student populations within the constraints of the new state law. We'll get into more of this during the panel, but I think it's been quite established that there is no substitute for race. And so the best we could do are Band-Aid approaches and other efforts. But we'll hear more. I'm looking forward to hearing our experts talk more. Before we do that, we'd like to show you a short clip. In 2019, 3 Frame Media produced the feature documentary film Unlikely, which was co-directed and narrated by Jay Fenderson, who you met earlier, a former college admissions officer at Columbia University. The film examined college dropout rates and what some forward-thinking institutions are doing to support students through their higher education journey. In this clip, Khalif, a student in Georgia, shares some of the barriers he faced as he applied to his dream schools. And we look at some of the admission policies ingrained in our higher education system that can hold students back. So with that, we'll show the clip.
No, just came, just kind of like my own little thing. I associate a lot of success with doing well with whatever I'm pursuing, doing great in it, being the best at it. And so my biggest thing was I want to go to college and I wanted to be the best and do what I could to be successful. So I wanted to get into Georgia Tech or Emory. Hey guys.
Nice to see you.
When I was working as a touring musician, it was great for the travel, but everything changed when Khalif was coming along. You know, it's like, okay, I gotta now think of my son and what's going to be best for him. And we know that one very important part of rearing kids is education.
And this is Khalif with his sister. This is a famous one I like too. He's 1 year old. And he's already talking to making contacts, wheeling and dealing.
Khalif is a very studious young man, very smart. This young in high school, I think he finished second in his class.
My mom always was telling me, she always joke around. She always be like, Cleve, B's are for butts. Only get A's.
And I always knew that he was going to be a brilliant young man. He's going to be somebody someday.
I didn't really have the money to like go to college, but my mom would always say, you know, Cleve, you make good grades, college is gonna be coming after you, and they're gonna be asking you, they're gonna be throwing money at you. You're a young black man doing things, you know, they need more of you in the world and stuff like that. And I just was like, oh, okay, cool, I'll do my best.
For Bob Anderson, the task of getting into college has been completed. He's now arriving on campus to begin his first year. Just what did Bob do to gain admission to the college of his choice?
Getting into a selective school like Georgia Tech and Emory, where Khalif applied, takes more than just good grades. With only about 20 minutes to spend reading each application, I was looking for things that really made a student stand out: a unique talent or ability, strong recommendation letters, an engaging essay, and of course, test scores.
I did not score well on the ACT and the SAT, where other students that like may have had prep for this their whole lives, I didn't even know about these really big things until later in high school, my senior year. But like, I graduated with like a 4.01 or something like that. I took hard classes and I took AP classes and graduated third in my class. But this one test we take one day at one point a year limits us. And so that's crazy to me.
We know that the data on testing are that there are huge disparities for racialized populations, by class, by gender in certain fields. So when you know that something has that kind of disparate impact, you gotta stop using them.
And yet, colleges continue to use them, despite the fact that Black and Latino students score significantly lower than their white and Asian peers. This is one of the arguments for affirmative action, but critics say this gives preferences in a process that should be based on merit. However, giving preferences to particular groups of students is nothing new in college admissions. It happens all the time with recruited athletes, sons and daughters of wealthy donors, and children of alumni. That's legacy. The policy was introduced in the early 1900s by elite schools as a way to exclude immigrants. But now, schools defend the practice by saying it creates a sense of community and increases alumni giving. In 2018, 29% of Harvard's freshman class was legacy, and being the child of alumni is basically equivalent to scoring 160 points higher on the SAT. Emory is a school that gives special consideration to legacy, but neither of Khalif's parents went there, so his application had to stand on its own merits.
Great. Look forward to seeing the rest of that. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists and welcome them to the stage. Up here already, we have Yolanda Copeland-Morgan, former Vice Provost of Enrollment Management at my alma mater, UCLA, where she served for 11 years. Mamie Voigt, President and CEO of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, here from Washington, D.C. Dr. Michael Bastedo, Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies and Professor at the Marshall Family School of Education at the University of Michigan, here from Michigan. And distinguished Dr. Gary Orfield, Distinguished Professor. He said distinguished twice because he deserves that. UCLA Graduate School of Education, co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA and author of a recent book, The Walls Around Opportunity, the Failure of Colorblind Policy for Higher Education. So with that, we'll begin our discussion. Gary, we'll start with you.
All right.
In your book, your most recent book, The Walls Around Opportunity, you discuss how colorblind policies have made higher education inaccessible for underrepresented, minoritized students and have really resegregated our schools since the Reagan era. Can you tell us
what are these major colorblind policies that have snuffed off opportunities since the early 1980s?
Well, I would start with why we got color-conscious policies to start with. It was really a result of the civil rights movement. We discovered in the early voting rights legislation and early school segregation efforts and so forth, that if you just make it a possibility, it doesn't happen unless you actually have a plan and you implement the plan seriously. That's what happened in the 1960s. Affirmative action was adopted by almost all the major selective universities in the country, and it was imposed on the South as a result of the civil rights movement. Up until then, there was almost no representation of students of color in selective universities in the United States. It made a difference. It didn't change the world, but it made a substantial difference. The conditions that came out of the civil rights revolution and that period were low tuition, expansion of spaces, the invention of federal financial aid, which came in the Higher Education Act and then the Pell Grants in the early 70s, and of course affirmative action. All of these things together produced a huge change in the country. The most equitable starting college period in American history came in 1978, when there was really an equal chance across racial lines to start college. Beginning in the 80s, we saw, well, actually beginning with the Nixon administration, two Southern California presidents really were leading the attack on affirmative action. Richard Nixon abandoned effective enforcement of the Civil Rights Act, which had produced the desegregation of Southern schools and universities. It relied on a fund cutoff mechanism. He abandoned it by the half point in his first year. The Supreme Court began to change dramatically. Nixon got 4 appointments. Since that time, all of the Supreme Courts that we've had in the last 52 years have had a majority of appointments from conservative presidents. We haven't had one with a majority of Democratic appointees since 1971. So we've got an increasingly conservative court that's a result of politics. We have the adoption of the Southern Strategy by President Nixon, which said we should pull back on civil rights enforcement. And then we had the appointment of justices that were opposed to civil rights. For example, William Rehnquist, who later became Chief Justice, had been opposed to the Brown decision as a clerk on the Supreme Court. So what happened then was by the 1980s, we began to see a frontal attack on race-positive policies. The idea of the Civil Rights Revolution and the Great Society was you can't change these things without naming the problem and addressing it directly and dealing with discrimination as a basic reality. By the middle 1980s, we have the first Supreme Court decision that says that it's just as bad to consider race positively as it is to consider race negatively. That was in the Croson decision, unemployment in Richmond. My first teaching job was at the University of Virginia. I had a black graduate student who had worked for the Richmond city government. He said whenever a black candidate got in the top 3, one of his assignments was to underline their telephone number, and then they would never be called. But Richmond was considered to be race neutral enough for the Supreme Court to limit affirmative policies on contracting. By the Reagan administration, we see a direct attack on school desegregation. They ask the courts to end it. And they appoint justices, and they appoint William Rehnquist, who opposed school desegregation consistently as Chief Justice. We also see that in the states. Here in California, Proposition 1 was enacted, which took away the state power to desegregate the schools. Los Angeles became the first major city in the United States to abandon its desegregation plan in 1981 and to elect an anti-desegregation school board. Right now, Latinos in California are the most segregated in the United States, and blacks are the second most segregated. Most of the blacks are segregated inside predominantly Latino schools, where more than 3/4 of the kids are poor. we find what happened in the courts was that by the early 90s, the conservative policies against race-conscious policies are being adopted. In school desegregation, it comes about in 1991. The Supreme Court says it's time to end the desegregation plans. Every year before then, from the 1960s to the middle 80s, the schools were becoming more integrated in the country. Every year since then, they've become more segregated. And we're now back to a point of segregation that's more serious than when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And the segregation isn't just by race. It's by race, it's by class, it's by teacher experience, it's by curriculum. It's comprehensive. Here in California, we find, as a result of these various decisions, for example, that a Black or Latino student has only 1/5 the chance of being in a high-achieving school in mathematics as a white or an Asian student. Believe me, that affects the path of college immensely. So college, there was an effort to extend the opposition to school integration to abandoning affirmative action in 2003. It was defended successfully by the University of Michigan, and some of the people who are in this room were involved in that. But of course it came back once President Trump got 3 Supreme Court appointments. The University of Texas had been challenged twice in the Supreme Court, and each time the Supreme Court had upheld affirmative action. The exact same issues were made after Trump's appointments, and we lost affirmative action. There are almost no major race-conscious policies left in the United States in terms of federal law. There are in some states, there are many things that you can do related to desegregation and to affirmative action. But basically the courts are on the other side now as a result of the appointments that were made during the Trump term. We now are in a situation where being race conscious positively is considered to be a danger. And it was forbidden in public schools in 2007 in the Parents Involved decision that undermined many voluntary school desegregation policies. So we have had a pattern of expansion to actually solve racial problems that happened in the 1960s, carried over into the early 70s. Ever since then, it's been under attack, and now it's been largely eliminated. So we're at a situation back like Plessy, or we're talking about separate but equal. But in another Supreme Court decision, in the Rodriguez case, the court said we can't get separate but equal either, because there is no right to education in the federal Constitution, so there's no right to an equal education. So we are in a very rugged position now as a result of a sustained effort to eliminate what was accomplished in the Civil Rights Revolution. And I think all of us have to think very hard about what we can do. In the book that I did, basically there's 2 things. There's race conscious, which I believe is essential. There's also race-sensitive policies, which I think are where we are now. Policies designed by people who understand what race is like and what families of color are going through in their actual lives, and come up with policies that will work for those young people, some of which we've heard talked about in the first panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oldfield. The history is so important and very sobering. Mamie, in the recent brief that I have did for the campaign, or with the campaign for College Opportunity, you all looked at and you scrutinized the common recruitment and admissions policies and practices, and found there were significant racial and ethnic disparities in those practices. Can you walk us through some of that? What are the specific admissions and recruitment practices that from your view are cementing racial inequity? It's kind of taking us down to that level of detail.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that question, Max, and thank you for the history behind this, because it really lays the groundwork really well for where we stand now. And I'll give a few examples from our research around some of the policies and practices that currently exist that are cementing these inequities within our higher education system. You heard some of them mentioned in the video, things like legacy admissions, which are very explicitly giving preference to individuals who are, by definition, not first-generation college goers. By definition, they have the types of advantages that come with having family members who have already gone through the college admissions process. So some of those policies and practices are really explicit. There are some other ones that are not as obvious, may not come to mind as immediately when thinking about the inequities within our higher education system. Things like the use of early admissions and early decision policies that give a boost in admissions chances for students who have the time and the money and the flexibility and the knowledge through college counseling to be able to apply early to colleges. Through early decision, there are some really strong inequities built into the use of early decision policies, which require students to commit to attending one institution if they are admitted to that institution, which eliminates the ability to compare financial aid offers across different institutions. And putting away that opportunity to compare financial aid offers simply is not on the table, not an option on the table for many students from low-income backgrounds who need to consider what the financial aid package looks like. In fact, we see that students from low-income families are less likely to take advantage of, be able to take advantage of these early admissions policies. So among students with similarly high test scores, students from families making more than $250,000 a year apply early decision 29% of the time, whereas similarly scoring students from low-income families earning less than $50,000 a year apply early decision only 16% of the time. So it's 29% versus 16%. And that has real impacts on who gets into college and is able to access these selective institutions. The benefit of applying early is equivalent to about 100 points on the SAT. So it has a real measurable impact on who attends college and where they can attend. Just a second example that I'll offer is around demonstrated interest policies. And this is sort of a wonky, intricate aspect of the admissions process that gives a benefit in admissions to students who are able to demonstrate their interest in attending that institution. They can demonstrate that interest through things like going on a campus visit, or things like clicking on links in emails from the institution or emailing the admissions office. There are some really deep inequities buried within this policy as well. For one, if students get a boost in their admissions chances by attending a college visit, then that is reliant upon those students being able to afford traveling to the campus and attending that college visit. It's reliant upon their parents possibly needing to take time off work to accompany them on the campus visit. So those types of opportunities are not equally accessible and available to all students. And then even some of those ways that I mentioned around clicking on links in emails where you might say, okay, well that's equally available to all students. Not everybody knows that clicking on a link in an email is going to give you a boost in your chance of admissions. However, students from higher income families who have access to college counselors who are giving them really intricate advice about the way that the college admission system works, they will know to click on those links. They will boost their chances through these really fine-grained aspects of the system. So I'll stop with just those two examples. They're only two of very many examples of the policies and practices that continue to cement these inequities. I'm happy to get into more as we get through question and answer.
Thank you, Mary. We're going to now shift a little bit to what can we do. And I think you didn't say this, Mamie, but I'm just wondering, like I believe you're suggesting that those practices need to be looked at and possibly dismantled or removed, changed. Right?
Absolutely. So the work that we have been doing at IHEP, the Institute for Higher Education Policy, in partnership with the Campaign for College Opportunity, has been to advocate for these practices to be eliminated. Things like early decision, early admissions, demonstrated interest, the use of legacy as a preference in admissions should be eliminated. And the movement towards these changes in admissions policies is all the more important now that affirmative action is no longer on the table. I want to be clear, these things existed before the recent Supreme Court decision, and they were a problem before the recent Supreme Court decision, but the urgency is all the more higher now that we no longer have affirmative action on the table as an option.
Thank you. And Michael, the next question is for you. You authored a brief that discussed the value of holistic review for racial equity in higher education, particularly in the post-affirmative action environment. Is the practice of colleges and universities looking at the unique experiences of students and assessing a number of indicators such as high school that they attended, socioeconomic status, to make admissions decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about what a good holistic review admissions process could look like and how that could help with racial equity gaps? And I do want to note that I know that Berkeley initially led the charge in California after affirmative action was eliminated. This is after they retrenched and tried to make it harder for students, but then they then led the way on a form of holistic admissions that then UCLA also tried to refine and do, and then the legislature in California really pushed, and I remember this because I was staff in the legislature, to have the University of California adopt holistic review as one strategy, because of course we were looking at everything, all types of strategies as we're discussing. So can you talk a little bit about, Michael, in your research, what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Am I here?
You can use it.
Can I use yours?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm not very good with these things. Thank you very much for having me, and congratulations to the campaign on your anniversary. I'm sure you're really proud, and you should be. So for me, the answer is context, context, context. And the reason is that a lot of the other things that are pushed for as part of the admissions process are the things that you can't be changed, or they're not focusing in on the thing that most students are really admitted on, which is academic credentials. It's been a little dismaying to me after SFFA that it seems like that a lot of focus has been if we can just get students to write the right kind of essay that that demonstrates the right kind of perseverance and overcoming obstacles, that's going to mean that they're going to get in, or that's going to somehow undo SFFA. And it's understandable why that advice is being given. The court kind of opened that up through its own decision and what it wrote in the decision. But students aren't being admitted on essays. They can provide contextual and helpful information, but that's not what's primary. But we can provide really good contextual data and information to admissions officers to help them understand the high schools and neighborhoods that students come from, so that when they are looking at the credentials that students present, that they can actually treat them fairly. I think UC is actually a leader in this, and maybe Ilana wants to talk about that, because they have excellent information that comes out of the UC office that's provided to admissions officers, and they marry that with data from Landscape, which provides high school and neighborhood information. Thank you all. High school and neighborhood information to all of the admissions officers to be able to do that. Because if you can't look at credentials in light of the opportunities that are available in high schools and neighborhoods, there is absolutely no chance that you can treat them fairly in the process. So those are definitely some things that I would identify and highlight. And I think that another issue around the essay component is the problem that students may be encouraged to sort of pimp their pain, as people much younger than me say, and they shouldn't have to do that, right? They should be able to focus on their own accomplishments, and if that means persevering over some obstacles in their life, that's really helpful and important information. But they shouldn't have to sort of expose their traumas in order to be admitted to college. And I think most admissions officers don't want that, and I think most students don't want to do that, so I hope that we're not encouraging students to do that in this process. As I said, one of the things that I do find exciting is that Landscape is being adopted by over 200 colleges in this country to provide consistent, robust, contextual information to admissions officers, and we have good information to show that schools that adopt that are more likely to admit students from disadvantaged neighborhoods and high schools once they have that information. Where the problem is right now is about enrollment. So I can show you that it's moved the needle on admission of students from disadvantaged contexts, but those students aren't then enrolling at the same rate. And so we need to figure out what might be happening in the process so that it's not yielding the benefits that we would like it to provide.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Michael, and maybe we can circle back after we have Yolanda share a little bit. And Yolanda, you have worked in university admissions for over 30 years, and the last of those 11 years at UCLA, overseeing all enrollment management and admissions, then previously with Syracuse, Harvey Mudd, Occidental. During your tenure at UCLA, your leadership led to the most socially, economically, and ethnically diverse class in UCLA's history. And we know UCLA, I believe, is still the #1 university in terms of applications, right, in the country. How did you do that? And how do you, and from what you learned there, how do you take those lessons to a large institutions like UCLA and competitive institutions like UCLA, especially our private institutions here in California that are now subject to the affirmative action ban? What can other universities learn from what you've done and what you've learned over your 30 years in this work?
Actually, you're going to be, I guess this still doesn't work.
Thank you. Improvise.
Thank you so much. And actually, you'll be a little surprised that it's actually 44 years that I spent in higher education.
So sorry.
Just had the opportunity to retire. Although my first lesson I learned about retirement is you don't really retire about education. But I do have a lot more free time. Let me say this about, and you'll find lots of articles and newspaper reviews where I've talked about this subject. But this is not rocket science. I was Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Harvey Mudd College, where we did nothing but science. This was not the kind of problems they were trying to solve there. I've summed this up by saying that colleges and universities, and I say this to people who call me, to do consult and review their operations, colleges and universities have to be honest about what their intent is, what their priorities are. We all have mission statements, right? And we all have interpretations of what that mission statement means. So first we have to be honest, and I say that to boards of trustees and to donor committees and all sorts of groups that I've met with, presidential groups. And we're not always honest, and some of my reports that I've done have said that to the college and to the university. Secondly, and this is a big one, we have to put our money where our mouth is. Colleges and universities say they want diversity, but I guarantee you if you look at most colleges and universities' budgets, their diversity programs are funded on temporary dollars. Oftentimes one-time grants from a donor or an organization who wants a report at the end of the year sharing with them how much you were able to accomplish. Well, I tell them in advance, nothing. 1 year only gives you an opportunity, you and your team, to set up strategies and practices that may increase diversity. But you have to put your money where your mouth is. And I had the honor of working for and being mentored by Dr. John Slaughter, as many of you know, just passed away 2 days ago. And for Nancy Cantor, who was in The Unlikely film, which I highly recommend that you watch. I actually showed it to my entire, bless you, I just have to say that. A film that I showed to my entire enrollment management division. That's how powerful I think that film is. But I went to my chancellors and said, if you're serious about diversity, I need guaranteed funding. I need the ability to talk to donors about supplementing our efforts, because you cannot do admissions in the same way. So when you ask me how did I do it, let me share with you a couple of things. So one of the things we share in common is I have 11 practices colleges and universities need to get rid of. One of those examples are one-time scholarships, one-year scholarships. Get rid of them. If you want diversity, one-year scholarships do nothing. If you're going to give a student $10,000, I'd rather see you give them $2,500 a year for 4 years, so that at least they can figure out what the problem is before they start at your college or university. Many underrepresented students don't understand that. So let's get rid of the one-year scholarship policies. Secondly, equity is not packaging every student, and I came from financial aid into the enrollment field, right? Equity is not giving every student the same amount of work and loan in a financial aid package. That's equality, but it's not equity. And so we have to stop practices like that. If you're serious about diversity, you have to lower those loan amounts that you're awarding. Lower the amount of work hours that a student from middle class or lower socioeconomic or rural communities or reservations, the obligation that they will have, because they're the very students who need to take advantage of the co-curricular experience that our colleges and universities offer. The other thing is we have to look at transfer students. The students that we're talking about are more likely, you can applaud because UCLA is #1 in transfer enrollment. I said, if we're serious about diversity, we have to go where students are. And then the next thing, and you can read this online, I formed a group called the Collaborative. And the Collaborative was an acknowledgement when I came to UCLA. One of the questions I asked is to see research on who's getting in and who's not getting in, right? And what is our experience with minority students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, so on and so forth, and they couldn't tell me. If we can't share that data, and I'm not talking about what you see on the UC website, I mean going through the applications and really getting detailed information. Doing that review allowed me to go to the then superintendent and assistant superintendent of LA Unified School District, to Pasadena School District, and to Inglewood in our own neighborhoods, and said to them, I want to work with you and your teachers, previous panel, right, was just so spot on. Work with you and your teachers and your counselors to share with you how you can get more of your students to a UCLA, to a Berkeley, to a Claremont College, so on and so forth. Because even the best of their students were not getting into our colleges and universities, but if they understood more of what we were looking for in a holistic admissions process, I thought those students would not only get into UCLA, but they'd get into other colleges and universities. And there are reports out there, and that is exactly what happened for UCLA, for the UC system, and the UC system followed our lead in how we were doing that. So if we don't work with the community to build what I call relationships of trust with teachers, with college counselors, with parents, with the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Clubs, so they know who we are, then they would, if we don't do that, they will respond like I responded when my husband and I sent our last child to a predominantly white institution. I looked around and I said, who's gonna take care of my black boys at this university? And in the parent meeting, the big auditoriums where they have all the parents, my question was, I saw one black faculty here the whole time. And to that president's credit, he said, that is the only one that we have. And so my question was very different from the majority. And the same would be with Latino families, right? Or those students from underrepresented Asian backgrounds, like Laotians, Vietnamese. It's Asians have huge underrepresentation, even despite the number of Asians that we see in our colleges and universities. There are lots of them that we need to focus on. So in short, what I'm saying is we have to focus on what our priorities are, get rid of a lot of the old admissions practices, a lot of the old financial aid practices and work with our faculty. Gary, I just love you. I read everything you write. Work with our faculty and others who have expertise in these areas, not that they're admissions or enrollment professionals, but they're doing work that will help us to develop policies and practices that will lead to diversity. Among all the things that we did and that UCLA is doing, it was really about being present in the community, building those relationships of trust so that students could aspire to be at UCLA, and at the same time, their parents or guardians would know that we would take care of them. And I'll give you one last example, that things that I changed. We always hosted our programs on UCLA's campus, where we're all working professionals. Many of us have children. Who has time after a 12-hour day to get in a car, drive to Westwood, which a lot of my parents had never been to attend a 7 p.m. admissions conference? So we stopped that. We started, and again, you can find it on the website. I went to Starbucks in the community, in the greater Los Angeles community, and said, hey, I want to do admissions and financial aid workshops in your facilities. No, I don't have any money. I don't want to pay rent. So that minority students in this community can learn more about what it takes to prepare students to be competitive for college admissions. People thought I was crazy. Till this day, 6 Starbucks in greater Los Angeles give up their space for us to go in and do admission and financial aid workshops. So it is just throwing away the old thing. Try something new. If it fails, it won't be the first time. Then you can go on to something else. But you will learn if you get rid of some of the old practices and listen to young people, begin to innovate, and I guarantee you, you'll see some changes.
Thank you, Yolanda. I heard a lot in there. You gave us so much. I heard people, I heard culture, I heard leadership, I heard policies, I heard practices. I think the big takeaway I heard was hope and possibility, but also being creative, innovative, and trying new things. So thank you so much for that. I think we're going to go to Q&A, and so we have a little more time. Okay, all right, good. Okay, good. Well, let me then just circle back with the panel, because now we've said a lot of things, and I'm curious if anything has bubbled up for you as you've been listening. And I'll turn to Dr. Orfield first.
One of the things I love about Yolanda is that she says, let's just keep trying things. If they don't explicitly forbid it, we'll positively try it. And if anybody comes after us, we'll defend it. And we'll just keep going until we get some stuff that actually works. One of the conclusions of my book was that if you don't have affirmative action, if you don't have race explicit policies, you've got to have commitment. You've got to have results orientation. You have to have rewards to people who make it happen. And people who can invent the ways to make it happen, because they have to be invented in all kinds of creative and devious ways now to make it happen. So I think that that's very important for all of us now in this situation. And I think that was true at UCLA. You had support. You could get the money. There's a lot of colleges that don't have money and are tuition driven and are really very resource limited. And so it's very hard for them to do this, because indirectly admitting students of color is much more expensive than doing it directly, because you have to reach much deeper. And if you're using any kind of, I won't call it a proxy, but anything that is likely to identify a disproportionate number of minority students, they're going to need additional financial aid, because it won't identify the minority students that are in the elite schools and are actually prepared and have families with resources. That group is really excluded by the loss of affirmative action, and they are, of course, the people who are most prepared to succeed in elite colleges, which is part of the great tragedy. We're getting more and more students like that, and we can't give them special consideration in the substitutes for affirmative action. I think that will and determination and creativity are very important, and thinking about all of the places in the book that I did, talking about like 12, 13 places on the pipeline to college where you could fall out. And a lot of them aren't leaks, they're crevices. Think about each one of those and what you can do about them. Can you help people with a 9th grade transfer into high school so that you get the right subjects? Can you think about ways to train more counselors so they actually know about colleges? Because most counselors don't get any training in college admissions. Can you think about ways to get more counseling resources in? Can you think about ways to get parents to help fill out the financial aid forms? Because the counselors don't have any special training in that either. So you think about each one of the links that's missing and what could be done about it, because each one will help to some extent.
Mammy, Michael, Yolanda, do you go ahead?
Yeah, I think some things that Yolanda said sparked some additional thinking as well. She talked about these creative recruitment efforts and going out into the communities, as well as this idea of putting your money where your mouth is. And one of the things that has come up in our work in this area is around recruitment. And that some of the research has found that some of the most selective institutions, they're going to predominantly white areas, they're going to high-income high schools, and that's where they're putting their money. That's where they're putting all of their recruitment efforts, is in these well-resourced institutions where these students are likely to go to college anyway, regardless of whether that recruitment visit happens or not. What they're not doing is visiting the nearby schools that may not even be that far away, that are predominantly composed of students of color or students from low-income backgrounds. And so that's a question of resources and money and how the institution is choosing to spend its money and direct its admissions counselors. And so I think that piece of it is a really core component. The other aspect is around data use. And Yolanda said this is not necessarily rocket science. There are some simple ways that you can figure out what is working and what is not in terms of recruiting a diverse class. And institutions can use the data that they have to analyze what does the early action pool of candidates look like at your institution? What are the racial demographics? What are the socioeconomic demographics? And doing the same for many of these other aspects of their recruitment policies and practices to then identify which ones need to be eliminated, which ones need to be changed, but bringing real data and evidence into those conversations to shape the more equitable solutions.
Thank you, Mammy. I think we're going to go to Q&A with the last 10 minutes that we have. You can just hand me the yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, this is an interesting one. How does the U.S. News and World Report drive many of the inequities, like early decision, legacy admissions, and demonstrated interest? If any of you have.
Comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll comment as an all disclosure. I spent 10 years on their advisory board because I was concerned about the disproportionate impact that they were having on school selection. But, and I guess the thing that I would say is it doesn't have the same impact that it used to. And if you have an opportunity to serve on an advisory board where you can bring that unique voice to say, look, we shouldn't be using SATs. When we as an advisory board told them, you gotta stop using SATs, they stopped using the SATs. When we talked about you need to start looking at Pell Grant, they started looking at the number of Pell Grant students that institutions were serving. So I just wanna put that out there because there's a lot of big organizations that are driven for different reasons, but if we can partner with those organizations to help them see that they're actually bringing harm to some of the values that they really espouse, then that I would encourage you to be a part of that and make a change rather than seeing it as going into the lion's den.
One of the things that's interesting about that is everybody in the academic world knows that these aren't very good ratings, and everybody who gets a good rating on it puts it on their front page.
Okay, well, next question from our K-12, probably from our K-12 focused organizations. What can K-12 organizations and advocacy groups do to support these efforts despite tending to have less visibility in the higher ed space? Where can or should they be plugging in? And I know we have a couple of K-12 focused advocacy groups here that are doing really great work. So any thoughts on that?
I think the big thing that we ought to do right now is to create a serious higher ed consideration of how we can help high schools. Because K-12 is totally unequal. And the assumption that exists in admissions offices that somehow everybody's had a reasonable chance to prepare is ridiculous and absurd in terms of what goes on. You know, a C in a good suburb is like an A with the same level of work in many urban schools. And there is no equivalent of a suburban A in many of those schools because there's no classes that run at that level. There's very few experienced teachers that teach the key courses and so forth. So we ought to think about, if we're going to abolish race-conscious admissions, let's think about equitable preparation. So let's think about having the key college access courses available on its grade level in every single high school, or advising the students who want to go to college to transfer to some other high school if that's impossible. When I was at Chicago, we did a study of the high schools in the city. We published a list of 25 schools you should transfer out of if you're going to go to college, because nobody successfully went to college from those places. We ought to think seriously about higher ed looking at how it can help and how it can, using the dual admissions programs in a much more equitable way. Because right now they often just help already privileged students get more college credits before they go. They don't help the kids who had no connection with college have that college connection. And they could if they were administered differently.
So glad you brought that up, because that's something where a number of us here in this room are focused on. And I know Chancellor Christensen, who's in the audience, is calling for students, all students, to have access to college credit courses before they actually finish high school, to get them on the path. And we know from the research that if that happens, they're more likely to go to college, right? And succeed in college. So thank you for that. I'm gonna go ahead and do another question because I think we're getting close to time, right? One of the questions from the audience is around colleges have incentives to recruit from certain neighborhoods or from certain schools. And they often recruit among students who will attend anyways and who are trying to decide which college to attend. How do we incentivize recruiting students who might or might not go to college? Like, how do we ensure colleges and universities go beyond, or go after the maybe crowd? And this is making me think a little bit about history, because I've been reading about this recently, and how the University of California used to have a percent that it could bring in of students that didn't meet the criteria way back when. But a lot of those students became leaders in the field and leaders of the state and the nation. And so I'm thinking about that as I'm reading this question. Those students that are on the cusp, they might not be competitively eligible, but they're still eligible, right? And could benefit. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think the question earlier, this ties to the question earlier around US News and World Report and the sort of chase for prestige in what an institution looks like. That's certainly part of the motivations for these types of policies and recruitment efforts. Another piece is that there's a very clear state policy lever here, in that many of these institutions, particularly the more cash-strapped institutions, the more enrollment-driven institutions, are reliant upon tuition dollars. And students who come in paying more, full-pay students who don't require as much financial aid, students from out of state at public institutions who pay a higher tuition, they are more attractive from a financial standpoint for these institutions to be able to break even. And so when states invest more thoroughly in the higher education system, in their public institutions, it helps to alleviate some of that financial pressure that the institutions are facing in trying to go through this calculus of their admissions practices. So this needs to be a combination of both institutional policies, institutional motivations, institutional values, and state policy and state investment in our higher education system to alleviate some of those financial pressures.
So the one thing I would add to that, and Gary, thanks for your remarks about K through 12, because what I learned through the collaborative was that our gifted and talented programs that many schools have start with the 2nd grade. And yet if we look at the research, we know there's a difference of more than 3,000 to 4,000 word vocabulary between kids who go to pre-K, pre-K versus those who don't. And you know the profile of those who don't have. So it starts very early, and I think, as I've told my colleagues in elementary school, get rid of this gifted and talented in the 2nd grade. You're already, you're ruling out students from rural communities and other geographies, and it starts very early. But the other thing I would just say is use your faculty. I didn't do this by myself. I went to faculty, looked at their expertise, and as I said, and I asked when I came on board to UCLA, I said, can I come and meet with the faculty? Are there any gatherings? The faculty said others, because our colleges and universities have experts in every aspect of the areas that we want, that where we're trying to solve problems. And so don't try to do it yourself. Teachers wanted to know from the collaborative, did we have any experts who could show them how to do better, more equitable grading? That was the request once we came together. So I just want to remind you, you can't do it by yourself. You need the entire faculty. You need people like Gary. You need folks like the folks in this room who are willing to go with you. And make that clear. And what I found at every university that I was at is that if we're more collaborative, then we go further. And by the way, the remark about deans of admissions and vice provosts for admissions going to highly selective school, you say, how do we stop it? I just told my folks, stop it. You're not doing that. You're going, to rural places in California, just below Oregon, to the neighborhoods, to the reservations where our students live and learn, and bring UCLA to them. So that's another thing that's out there on the web, is stop going deans and provosts, go to the inner city schools.
I'll say one thing is, for those of you interested in recruitment, I think the work of Karina Salazar and Ozan Chaquet on this is really excellent. And TCAS has published some of it, but they've also published some elsewhere. I really recommend looking at it. Everything Mimi said about that is absolutely true. Second thing I'll say is, if there's maybe a moment of hope in the last minute of this conversation, I think one of the most interesting and exciting things happening right now is around direct admission and guaranteed admission, which is not about holistic admission at all. It's about giving students a really clear signal that they can go to college and where they can go to college. And we have somewhat mixed results on this in terms of impact right now, but I think part of that is that it's a very new thing, and it's not really being marketed the way it could be. It's not really being clear to students in the way that it could be. There's a lot more that can be done. Also, guarantees are really powerful when they come with some actual cash. And so guaranteed admission and direct admission is not the whole solution if you don't think that you can afford to go in the first place. So, programs like HAIL at Michigan have been really powerful, but people are always talking to me, it's not an admissions program, it's a money program, right? I mean, you know that if you get admitted to Michigan under HAIL, that you're gonna have the money to be able to go. That's a much more powerful incentive than just knowing that you've been admitted. So being able to marry things like direct and guaranteed admission with a financial aid guarantee, or at least some level of transparency and simplicity, could be a really powerful combination.
Thank you for that. Yes, thank you for that. In closing the panel, I just want to ask any people in the audience, and if you're not comfortable identifying yourself, it's fine. How many are the product of affirmative action? I'll raise my hand too. And I wanted to do that because I know for me, and this is probably true for many of you, like those fights in the 90s really solidified my commitment, as well as having the opportunity to attend the University of California, to make sure that others could get that opportunity. And so I think the fact that a good number, I want to say half of the people in this room raise their hand, and you're all very successful, yeah. You did okay, affirmative action didn't hurt you. And it has actually helped society, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that those of us that benefited from affirmative action, like myself, that we are committed to opening the doors of opportunity. And this panel has actually been really inspiring. And we started out with all the issues, but also a lot of hope and possibility. And I think the fact that we're here today, and there's so many of us that are the children of affirmative action, also gives me hope and possibility. So thank you, and thank our panelists.